There is a city in southern China that did not exist 40 years ago. Not in the way cities are supposed to exist. It had no grand history, no ancient temples, no colonial architecture, no cultural monuments that tourists come to photograph. In 1979, it was a cluster of fishing villages surrounded by rice paddies, home to 30,000 people who had no reason to believe their lives would be anything other than what their parents' lives had been. Today, that same patch of land is home to over 13 million people. It is the hardware capital of the planet. If you have ever held a smartphone, worn a fitness tracker, flown a drone, or owned anything with a circuit board inside it, there is a very high chance that it was conceived, prototyped, or manufactured in Shenzhen. And yet, when people talk about China's rise, they rarely talk about Shenzhen. They talk about Beijing's political power. They talk about Shanghai's financial ambition. But Shenzhen is where the future is actually made. Not imagined, not funded. Made. With solder and lithium and late nights in factories that smell like burnt plastic and ambition. This is not a story about a city. It is a story about a question that the West has never been able to answer. How does a place with no infrastructure, no educated workforce, no capital, and no technology become the most important manufacturing ecosystem on Earth in a single generation? The easy answer, the one you hear in Washington and Brussels, is that China cheated, that it stole intellectual property, that it exploited labor, that it subsidized everything until the competition died. And yes, all of that happened. But if that were the whole story, then why did other cities with the same advantages, the same subsidies, the same authoritarian efficiency fail to become Shenzhen? Why is there only one Shenzhen? The answer is uncomfortable because it forces you to admit that something deeper happened here. Something that cannot be dismissed as theft or copied by simply throwing money at a problem. Shenzhen did not just learn how to make things, it learned how to learn. And that distinction, that quiet, unflashy mastery of the process of becoming competent, is the thing the West still does not understand. Let me take you back to the beginning. The year is 1980. Deng Xiaoping, the man who had survived Mao's purges and witnessed the catastrophic stupidity of the Great Leap Forward, had returned to power. He understood that China was desperately poor. He understood that the revolution had delivered political sovereignty, but not prosperity. And he understood that the Soviet model, the one that relied on state planning and ideological purity, was a dead end. So he did something that shocked the Communist Party. He declared that a small fishing village across the border from Hong Kong would become a laboratory, a place where capitalism could be tested without contaminating the rest of the country. If it failed, it could be contained. If it succeeded, it could be scaled. This was Shenzhen, the first special economic zone. A space where the rules of socialism would be quietly suspended. At first, no one wanted to go there. It was a backwater. The people who went were desperate. Farmers who had nothing to lose, young people fleeing the boredom of the countryside, former Red Guards who had been sent to labor camps during the Cultural Revolution and had no future in the cities they came from. Shenzhen was a place for the ambitious and the disposable. And the first thing they built was not factories. It was a border. A fence that separated Shenzhen from the rest of China. You needed a permit to enter. The message was clear. This place is different. The rules here do not apply anywhere else. Do not get used to it. The early years were chaos. Foreign investors, mostly from Hong Kong and Taiwan, were invited in. They brought money and know-how. They built factories to produce toys, shoes, textiles, cheap goods for export. The model was simple. Western companies would send designs. Shenzhen would provide land, labor, and compliance. The profit margins were thin. The work was brutal. 16-hour shifts, unsafe conditions, workers crammed into dormitories. But for people who had grown up in villages where there was no electricity and no future, a factory job in Shenzhen was an upgrade. It was cash, it was possibility. The city grew not because it was planned, but because it was hungry. And here is where the story begins to diverge from the narrative you have been told. The conventional wisdom is that Shenzhen succeeded because it had cheap labor, that foreign companies came, built factories, extracted value, and left the workers with nothing. But that is not what happened. What happened was something more subtle and more dangerous to the established order. Shenzhen began to absorb knowledge, not through formal education, not through licensing agreements, but through a process that can only be described as industrial osmosis. When a Taiwanese manager set up a toy factory in Shenzhen, he brought engineers. Those engineers trained local workers. Those workers learned not just how to operate machines, but how machines worked. When a Japanese electronics firm opened a plant to make radios, the local suppliers who provided plastic casings learned how to meet Japanese quality standards. They learned about tolerances, about materials, about supply chain logistics. And when those suppliers started getting inquiries from other companies, they realized they had knowledge that was valuable. They started their own businesses. This is the thing that no one talks about. Shenzhen did not steal technology in the way we imagine theft. It did not send spies into Silicon Valley boardrooms to photograph blueprints. It did something far more effective. It created an environment where knowledge leaked, where every transaction was also a lesson, where the boundary between the foreign expert and the local worker was porous enough that information flowed in both directions. And because Shenzhen had no legacy industries, no entrenched interests, no old way of doing things to protect, it could absorb that knowledge faster than anyone expected. By the late 1990s, something strange was happening. The factories that had been assembling products designed in America and Japan were starting to modify those designs. A factory that made Nokia phones would quietly produce a batch of phones that looked like Nokia's but had extra features: dual SIM cards, louder speakers, longer battery life. These were not authorized. They were not legal. They were called Shanzhai phones, fake phones, knockoffs. The Western press mocked them. But the people buying them, poor farmers in rural China, migrant workers in African cities, did not care about intellectual property law. They cared that these phones worked and cost a fraction of the price. And here is the key insight. The engineers making those Shanzhai phones were not just copying. They were learning how to design. They were learning what consumers actually wanted versus what corporations thought they wanted. They were iterating faster than the brands because they had no legal department, no focus groups, no quarterly earnings to worry about. They could try something, fail, and try again the next week. This was not innovation in the way Silicon Valley defines it. This was not a Stanford PhD writing a white paper. This was a 30-year-old technician in a cramped workshop in Huaqiang Bay, the electronics market at the heart of Shenzhen, figuring out that if you swap this chip for that chip, you can cut costs by 20%. And then selling that knowledge to 5 other workshops, and those workshops selling it to 10 others. This was distributed, chaotic, unregulated innovation. And it was ferociously effective. By the time Western companies realized what was happening, it was too late. The ecosystem had become self-sustaining. Shenzhen no longer needed foreign firms to tell it what to make. It had learned the grammar of hardware. It understood not just how to build a phone, but how to build the tools that build the phone, how to source the components, how to optimize the supply chain, how to manufacture at a scale and speed that no other place on Earth could match. Let me give you an example that will make this concrete. In 2007, Apple released the iPhone. It was designed in California, but it was made in Shenzhen. Specifically, it was assembled by a company called Foxconn in a facility so large it has its own zip code. Hundreds of thousands of workers, dormitories, cafeterias, a self-contained city dedicated to making one product. The common narrative is that China got the scraps. It got the low-value assembly work while Apple kept the high-value design and profit. And that was true, for a while. But what that narrative misses is what those workers and engineers at Foxconn learned. They learned how Apple's supply chain worked. They learned how to manage quality at scale. They learned how to coordinate thousands of suppliers across dozens of provinces. And when some of those engineers left Foxconn, they took that knowledge with them. They started their own companies. They built their own supply chains. And within a few years, Chinese companies were not just assembling phones designed in California. They were designing their own. Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo. These were not knockoffs. These were competitors. And in many cases, they were better. This is the part that makes people in the West uncomfortable, because it suggests that the advantage was not permanent, that the knowledge gap could be closed, that the thing we thought was ours, the know-how, the expertise, the technological edge, could be learned by people who were supposed to stay in their lane and assemble our products. Shenzhen proved that the emperor had no clothes, that the West's dominance was not based on some intrinsic superiority, but on a temporary monopoly on knowledge. And monopolies, once broken, do not come back. Now I need to tell you about a place within Shenzhen that embodies everything I have just described. It is called Huaqiangbei. If you have never heard of it, you are not alone. Most people outside of the hardware industry have not. But if you work in electronics, if you are an entrepreneur trying to build a gadget, if you are an engineer prototyping a new device, Huaqiangbei is the most important place in the world. It is a neighborhood of high-rise buildings, each floor packed with tiny stalls selling components, resistors, capacitors, screens, batteries, chips, motors, sensors. Anything you could possibly need to build anything electronic. You can walk in with a rough idea and walk out 3 hours later with a working prototype. There is no other place on Earth where this is possible. Not in Silicon Valley, not in Tokyo, not in Berlin. I want you to imagine what this means in practice. Let us say you are a startup founder. You have an idea for a new fitness tracker. In San Francisco, you would need to find a contract manufacturer. You would send them specifications. They would send you a quote. It would take weeks. Then you would wait months for the first prototype. If something was wrong, you would iterate. Each iteration would take months. By the time you had a working product, a year would have passed, and you would have burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars. In Shenzhen, you walk into Huaqiangbei with a sketch. You find a vendor who sells the sensor you need. He introduces you to another vendor who sells the casing. That vendor knows a factory that can do small batch manufacturing. You negotiate. You prototype. If something does not work, you walk 2 floors down and find a different supplier. You iterate not in months, but in days. This speed is not a luxury. It is a structural advantage. It means that hardware innovation in Shenzhen happens at a pace that makes the rest of the world look like it is moving in slow motion. And this is where the story becomes almost science fiction. Because the same ecosystem that allows a scrappy entrepreneur to prototype a fitness tracker in 3 days also allows the Chinese government to scale production of strategic technologies at a speed that terrifies Western defense planners. When China decided it wanted to dominate the electric vehicle battery market, It did not need to invent the technology from scratch. The know-how already existed in Shenzhen's supply chain. The factories that made lithium batteries for phones could be retooled to make batteries for cars. The engineers who understood battery chemistry were already there. The suppliers who provided raw materials were already there. All the government had to do was provide subsidies and demand. Within a decade, China went from being a minor player in EV batteries to controlling over 70% of global production. That did not happen because of central planning. It happened because Shenzhen had built the infrastructure, the expertise, and the speed to make it possible. This brings me to the most important and most uncomfortable part of this story. The part that explains why Shenzhen is not just a city, but a warning. For the last 200 years, the West has told itself a story about why it became dominant. It said that it succeeded because of superior values, democracy, rule of law, individual freedom, property rights. These were the ingredients of prosperity. And if other countries wanted to succeed, they needed to adopt those values. This was not just economic theory, it was moral certainty. It was the premise of the Washington Consensus. It was the logic behind the expansion of NATO. It was the reason why Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. The West had won not just a geopolitical contest, but a philosophical one. There was one correct way to organize a society, and that way was Western liberalism. Shenzhen breaks that story. Because Shenzhen succeeded without democracy. It succeeded without rule of law in the Western sense. It succeeded without property rights that would be recognizable to an American lawyer. And it did not just succeed modestly, it became the most important manufacturing hub on the planet. It became the place where the future is prototyped. This is not supposed to be possible. And yet it happened. And the implications of that are so destabilizing that most people in the West simply refuse to process them. Because if Shenzhen can succeed without adopting Western values, then maybe those values were not the cause of Western success. Maybe they were just a correlation. Maybe the real cause was something else. Access to resources, military dominance, a temporary technological edge. And if that is true, then the entire moral architecture that justifies Western dominance collapses. I am not saying that Shenzhen is a utopia. It is not. The costs of its success are real. The environmental damage is catastrophic. The labor conditions, while better than they were, are still exploitative by any humane standard. The inequality is obscene. The lack of political freedom means that when the system fails people, they have no recourse. But here is the thing. The people living in Shenzhen are not asking for your pity. They are not asking for your moral judgment. They are too busy building the devices you will buy next year. They are too busy iterating on the technologies that will define the next decade. They are too busy winning. And that is the part that the West cannot accept. Because if Shenzhen is winning, it means the game was never about values. It was always about competence. And competence, unlike values, can be learned. Now, let me tell you what happened when the West finally woke up to what Shenzhen had become. For years, American and European policymakers had been content to let China be the world's factory. It was a comfortable arrangement. The West got cheap goods, China got jobs, everyone won, or so the story went. But around 2015, something shifted. Western intelligence agencies started paying attention to the fact that the components in their military hardware were coming from Shenzhen, that the servers running critical infrastructure had chips manufactured in Guangdong, that the surveillance cameras installed in government buildings were made by a Chinese company called Hikvision. And suddenly, the comfortable arrangement did not feel so comfortable anymore. The panic was not just about security, it was about obsolescence. Because the same supply chain that made it cheap and easy to build consumer electronics in Shenzhen also made it cheap and easy to build military drones, facial recognition systems, and telecommunications networks. And China was doing exactly that. Huawei had become the world's leading supplier of 5G equipment. DJI controlled 70% of the global drone market. BYD was selling electric buses to cities in California. These were not just Chinese companies competing in global markets. They were Chinese companies dominating global markets in technologies that would define the next century. And they had all been incubated in the ecosystem that Shenzhen built. The American response was predictable. If you cannot compete, you regulate. If you cannot innovate faster, you sanction. Starting in 2018, the United States launched what it called a tech war. It banned Huawei from American networks. It pressured allies to do the same. It restricted the export of advanced semiconductors to China. It added hundreds of Chinese companies to an entity list that prohibited them from buying American technology. The message was clear. We are going to cut you off. We are going to starve you of the components you need. We are going to force you back into dependence. And here is where the story takes a turn that no one in Washington expected. The sanctions did not cripple Shenzhen. They turbocharged it. Because the moment China realized it could no longer rely on American chips, it did what Shenzhen had always done. It learned. The Chinese government poured hundreds of billions of dollars into semiconductor research. It offered massive subsidies to any company that could produce chips domestically. It poached engineers from Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. It created an environment where failure was acceptable as long as you were trying to solve the problem. And Shenzhen, with its culture of rapid iteration and its tolerance for chaos, became the center of that effort. Now, I need to be clear. China has not caught up to the cutting edge of semiconductor manufacturing. It cannot yet produce the most advanced chips that power the latest iPhones or AI systems. But it has made progress that shocked even the most pessimistic analysts. Companies like SMIC, China's largest chip maker, have managed to produce chips at the 7-nanometer node, a level of sophistication that was supposed to be impossible without access to Dutch-made lithography machines that the United States had blocked from export. How did they do it? No one knows for sure. But the prevailing theory is that they reverse-engineered older equipment, found workarounds, and brute-forced their way to a solution through sheer repetition and scale. This is the Shenzhen model. You do not wait for permission. You do not wait for the perfect solution. You try 100 imperfect solutions and see which one works. The lesson here is not that sanctions do not work. They do. They slow things down. They increase costs. They create friction. But they do not stop a system that has learned how to learn. And that is the existential problem the West now faces. For 200 years, the Western development model was based on a ladder. You started at the bottom, making simple things. Then you climbed to the next rung, making more complex things. And eventually, if you were smart and lucky and followed the rules, you reached the top, where you made the most advanced things. And the countries at the top, the United States, Germany, Japan, controlled access to that ladder. They decided who got to climb. They decided which technologies could be exported and which could not. They used that control to maintain their dominance. Shenzhen showed that you do not need the ladder. You can build your own. It will not be as elegant. It will not be as efficient. But it will get you to the top. And once you are there, the old gatekeepers lose their power. This is what terrifies Western strategists. Not that China will surpass the West in every technology, but that it will become self-sufficient in enough critical technologies that it can no longer be coerced. that the era of American technological hegemony, the thing that allowed the United States to sanction Russia, Iran, and North Korea into submission, will come to an end. Because you cannot sanction a country that does not need your technology. Now let me take you inside a specific building in Shenzhen that will help you understand what I mean. It is the headquarters of a company called BYD. If you have not heard of BYD, you will. It stands for Build Your Dreams, a name so earnest and unsophisticated that it sounds like a parody of Chinese corporate ambition. The company started in 1995, making rechargeable batteries for mobile phones. Cheap, low-margin work. The kind of thing that Western analysts dismissed as irrelevant. But the founder, a man named Wang Chuanfu, had a vision. He understood that batteries were not just a component. They were the key to the future of transportation. And he understood that if you could master battery chemistry, you could master electric vehicles. For years, BYD was a joke in the auto industry. It made clunky, ugly cars that no one outside of China wanted. But Wang did not care about being respected. He cared about iterating. Every year, BYD released new models. Every year, they were a little better, a little cheaper, a little more refined. And every year, the company reinvested profits into R&D. Not because it wanted to win awards, but because it wanted to survive. By 2020, something remarkable had happened. BYD was the largest seller of electric vehicles in the world, larger than Tesla, and its cars were no longer jokes. They were sleek, fast, and packed with technology that rivaled anything coming out of California or Germany. The company had climbed from making phone batteries to making cars that could compete with BMW in less than 25 years. This is the speed that Shenzhen enables. This is the thing that cannot be replicated in a system that prioritizes stability over iteration. In the West, a car company takes a decade to develop a new model. It focuses on perfecting every detail. It worries about brand reputation. It cannot afford to fail because failure means bankruptcy. In Shenzhen, failure is just data. You fail, you learn, you try again. And because the entire supply chain is local, you can fail faster than your competitors can succeed. But here is the twist. BYD did not do this alone. It succeeded because it was embedded in an ecosystem. The same suppliers that made components for Huawei's phones made components for BYD's cars. The same engineers who had worked at Foxconn assembling iPhones moved to BYD to design battery management systems. The same government officials who had subsidized solar panel factories subsidized charging infrastructure. This is what the Mayer economy looks like in practice. It is not a single heroic company pulling itself up by its bootstraps. It is a web of relationships, incentives, and state support that makes success not just possible, but probable. And this brings me to the most important economic concept that explains Shenzhen's dominance. It is called network effects. In economics, a network effect means that the value of a product or service increases as more people use it. Facebook is valuable because your friends are on it. The telephone is valuable because other people have telephones. But network effects do not just apply to products. They apply to ecosystems. Shenzhen is valuable because everyone in the hardware industry is there. If you are a component supplier, you move to Shenzhen because that is where the buyers are. If you are a manufacturer, you move to Shenzhen because that is where the suppliers are. If you are an engineer, you move to Shenzhen because that is where the jobs are. And once this flywheel starts spinning, it becomes almost impossible to stop. This is why American efforts to reshore manufacturing have failed so spectacularly. The CHIPS Act, a bipartisan bill passed in 2022, allocated over $50 billion to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. It was supposed to reverse decades of offshoring. It was supposed to make America self-sufficient. But 2 years later, the results have been disappointing. Companies have announced factories. They have broken ground. But they are struggling to find skilled workers. They are struggling to build supply chains. They are struggling with costs that are multiples of what they would pay in Asia. Because you cannot just recreate an ecosystem by throwing money at it. Ecosystems are organic. They grow over time. They depend on trust, relationships, and accumulated knowledge. And Shenzhen has 40 years of accumulated knowledge. You cannot catch up to that in 5 years, no matter how much money you spend. Now let me tell you about the darker side of this story. Because Shenzhen's success is not a fairy tale, it is a Faustian bargain. The city is the most surveilled place on Earth. There are more cameras per capita in Shenzhen than anywhere else in the world. Facial recognition is everywhere. Your face is scanned when you enter a subway station, when you cross the street, when you enter a shopping mall. The government knows where you are at all times, and it uses that information. If your social credit score drops, you cannot book a flight. You cannot get a loan. Your children cannot attend certain schools. This is the cost of efficiency. This is what it looks like when a state decides that order and growth matter more than privacy and freedom. And the people of Shenzhen have, for the most part, accepted this bargain. Not because they love authoritarianism, but because the alternative, the chaos and poverty of the past, is worse. I spoke to a factory worker in Shenzhen a few years ago. She told me that her parents had been farmers in Hunan province. They lived in a house with no running water. They ate meat maybe once a month. She now lives in an apartment with air conditioning. She owns a smartphone. She sends her daughter to a private school. When I asked her about surveillance, she shrugged. She said, "I have nothing to hide. And if cameras make the city safer, then I am fine with it." This is the part that Western liberals cannot process. Because it suggests that maybe, for some people, economic security is more important than political freedom. That maybe, in a society that has experienced famine and upheaval within living memory, stability is not oppression. It is a gift. I am not defending this system. I am explaining it. Because if you want to understand why Shenzhen works, you have to understand that it is built on a social contract that is fundamentally different from the one in the West. The state provides order, growth, and opportunity. In exchange, you do not question the state. But this contract is fragile. It depends on continuous growth. As long as incomes are rising, as long as opportunities are expanding, people tolerate the lack of freedom. But what happens when growth slows? What happens when the factories start closing? What happens when the next generation, the one that did not experience poverty, starts asking why they cannot criticize the government online? This is the question that haunts every Chinese policymaker, and it is the reason why the Chinese government is so obsessed with technological self-sufficiency, because they know that if they lose the economic engine, they lose everything. Shenzhen is now at a crossroads. For 40 years, it succeeded by being fast, scrappy, and shameless. It copied. It iterated. It ignored intellectual property. It built an ecosystem that prioritized speed over perfection. But that model has limits. You can catch up by copying, but you cannot lead by copying. And China now wants to lead. It wants to be the place where breakthroughs happen, where new technologies are invented, not just manufactured. This requires a different kind of ecosystem, one that tolerates risk, one that rewards creativity, one that allows people to challenge authority, to question assumptions, to fail in public without being punished. And here is the paradox. The same authoritarian system that made Shenzhen possible is now the thing holding it back. Because true innovation requires freedom, not political freedom necessarily, but intellectual freedom. The freedom to pursue ideas that seem crazy, the freedom to collaborate across borders without fear of being accused of espionage, the freedom to fail without losing your social credit score. And China does not have that freedom. It has control, it has scale, it has speed, but it does not have the chaotic, undirected, bottom-up innovation that produces the next iPhone or the next Google. This is the great test. Can an authoritarian state innovate at the technological frontier? Or does innovation require the messiness of democracy? No one knows the answer yet. But Shenzhen is where we will find out. Because if China can solve this problem, if it can create an innovation ecosystem that works without political freedom, then it will have invented something entirely new, a model of development that does not require liberalization. A model that says you can be high-tech and authoritarian at the same time. And if that model works, it will be the most disruptive political idea of the 21st century. Let me bring this back to the question I started with. How does a fishing village become the hardware capital of the world in 40 years? The answer is not theft. It is not cheap labor. It is not subsidies. Those things helped, but they are not the essence. The essence is that Shenzhen built a system that learns faster than anyone else. It created an environment where knowledge is not hoarded, but shared, where failure is not fatal, but instructive, where the distance between an idea and a prototype is measured in days, not months. And once you have that system, once you have that speed, you become unstoppable, not because you are better, but because you are faster. And in a world where technology is changing every 6 months, fast beats better. This is the lesson that the West refuses to learn. Because learning it would require admitting that the Western model is not the only model, that there are other ways to organize a society, an economy, a city, that the values we hold sacred, individualism, freedom, property rights, might not be the only ingredients for success, and that admission is too painful. So instead, we tell ourselves stories. We say that Shenzhen's success is illegitimate, that it is built on sand, that it will collapse as soon as the subsidies dry up, or the demographics turn, or the Communist Party makes a mistake. And maybe that is true. Maybe Shenzhen's moment will pass. But right now, in this moment, it is winning. And the world you live in, the devices you use, the technologies you depend on, are being shaped not in Silicon Valley, but in a city that most people cannot find on a map. Shenzhen is not the future. It is the present. And the present is being built by people who were told they could not compete, who were dismissed as copycats and cheaters, who were supposed to stay in their lane and assemble products designed by smarter people in richer countries. They did not listen. They learned. And now they are teaching the world a lesson that no one wanted to hear. That competence is not a birthright. It is earned, and it can be taken away.